Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part two of this little series. Whose cubit is it anyway? Where do weights and measures come from? So his constant theme, Protagoras, man is a measure of all things, part one. So it was basically in response to a question by Mark Beeson. Check out his channel as well, interesting stuff there. So the cubit, who's the measure of whose arm? Shouldn't it be mentioned whose arm it is? I think the cubit and derivatives are expressions of daily domestic measurement systems, some kind of rule of thumb to guide the building of a house, furniture, or quick land survey, and that's we'll extend that theme now more. So it's often said it's based on the king's foot. Well, people change over time. Kings and queens come and go. This is not actually a good system to build a civilization that's going to last centuries. And that's for convenience. Man is a measure of all things, but it is more to it than that. So Vitruvian Man, by illustration by Leonardo da Vinci, based on a description from Marco Vitruvius, Roman architect 2,000 years ago. And we looked at Vitruvian Man. We also have his metrological relief at the Ashmolean Museum. This was ancient practice to have something like a stone like this, and the measurements would be based off it. It was put on public display. They could get the measures. Now we also have a Salamis stone, where it's, instead of a relief where it's carved out, we have these etched lines in there. Multiple sets of measure built, especially into the Salamis stone. And if we superimpose that on top, we see how it's corresponding with this man is the measure of all things, long before Vitruvius. Okay, so we left off, and so this is from a old dictionary, 1946, just after World War II, before a lot of these things started to change, but they mention the different measure weights systems, but also how different cheese and butter weights, ale and beer measure, wine measure, timber, meat, bread and flour, and now the metric system is just everything is incorporated under one. So there's a lot of hate against the imperial system, but the imperial system contains information, and so what's happening with these systems? Well, we'll think about the imperial measure and metric and what they're able to get away with now. So when I was a young lad, you could buy a can of Coke for 10 cents, 20 cents, and now they're over $2. But what's happened is that the cans have actually got smaller. And so manufacturers now reduce the weights in their products to increase profit. The price remains the same or is increased, but the weights are slowly being reduced. So this is happening whether it's in cans of drink or butter, even bread and other things. Now weights have become deregulated. How much a standard loaf of bread is, how much a standard drinks are. Now some is still remained, but like pints and shots, but it's now standard business practice to reduce the weight of a product but increase the price, and for that not to be tied to some very good reason. Historically this was not only unethical, still is now, but it was actually illegal in the past. So multiple references in the Bible, but let's look at the Book of the Dead. I have not reduced the measuring vessel, I have not reduced the measuring cord, I have not encroached on the fields, I have not added to the pan of the scales, I have not tampered with the plumb bob of the scales. The plumb bob of the scales is this plumb bob hanging, and this is like a way to fine tune and keep your scales equal. But basically it's the Spell 25 Book of the Dead is in essence like the Ten Commandments or the books of law in the Bible, and whether it's the Magna Carta and these other, or the Code of Hammurabi, that certain legal practices were tied to honesty in weights and measures, and compensation being tied to that in case of those instances. But I do have an older video, Morality and Mythology of Weights and Measure from Ancient to Modern Era. I'll link that in the description because I go through that more. But the importance of legal systems, but also morality systems being confined, coming from the authenticity and standardization of weights and measures, and that you shouldn't muck around with that. So we don't have a king standing around to measure your foot, but for instance here, St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, Austria, okay, on the side of the church there are these bars. One would be the drapery L and one would be the linen L. So the different grades of cloth, but they're also sold at a different measure because You would need more linen, for instance, to make clothing, that type of stuff, or to use in various products. But the drapery also, basically like drapes, that was a more expensive material. It was sold, it was a shorter L. But the principle was that at the marketplace, on the side of cathedral, this would be in place so that anyone could come along and verify their measures. Also that if a faraway merchant came along, that he could adjust his measurements and the way he was selling them. It would be enforced by law that this is what the L is and you must measure by that, so you would avoid problems. Other examples, we have the L and also the foot. Interesting, that number. I'll get into more of that later because that's some cool stuff. But anyway, official measures would be placed on display at marketplaces for merchants and buyers to easily verify and avoid prosecution that you're underselling your products. This was a big issue. Freiburg Minster Cathedral, around about 1200 that was completed. On the side of the church we have these symbols, and what are they? They're bread sizes, so the large round loaf and the small loaf, the small almond-shaped loaf and the large almond-shaped loaf. So the bread, this was the size of the bread that you had to sell, and it was an important feature because bakers could reduce their size, and before more consumer protections now, and there was ancient, for instance, the German purity laws in beer, that the beer had to be made with a grade of so many ingredients, so much per ingredient, and sold at a quality standard, but also at a size standard. In the 1200s, 13th century England, the size of bread and ale laws linked the weight of bread to the price of wheat grains. It also governed the quality of bread and ale, so that each loaf of bread had a certain weight, but also a quality, so that meant basically one loaf of bread per day and one mug of ale per day would give you a guaranteed amount of calories, which meant you had enough food to work, and this was an important protection. Now, the slice of bread and ale laws took in the cost of ingredients, so it allowed business and trade to flourish while also protecting consumers from those who would squeeze profits by reducing quantity and quality, allowing for a stable and dynamic economy. The weights of coins or currency was linked to the official weights, so an ounce or a penny had a certain weight which you could use to verify. And so, for instance, in a bad year the price of grain went up, but the price of a loaf of bread stayed the same. Now the weight of the loaf would be reduced accordingly. However, in a good year, the price of one loaf would stay the same, but the weight was increased. This doesn't happen now. It's only going in one direction now. So they reduce the weight, they increase the price, they reduce the weight. Doesn't matter if you have a good harvest or a bad harvest, it just keeps going on. But back in the day, the price of the raw material was connected to the product itself and then linked to the currency, and this was a way to keep a stable economy, but also to guarantee that people were healthy and fed, because a bread would be, or the amount of meat, the amount of bread, the amount of ale you consumed would be linked to your work level. So whether it's meat, bread and flour, butter and cheese, beer and ale, wine measures, they were all set at a certain level, and each, for instance, a cheese wheel of a certain size would be, basically enough for one family per week, and each person got a loaf of bread per day, and so many cups of wine or ale to keep you healthy and going on. Also, casks were set at a certain size. Again, so that so many drinks or servings per cask was in there, but also it was good for tax keeping reasons. So, for instance, if you're a wine or a beer producer, the tax man could come along and just count the number of barrels and then know how much is in them and then adjust your tax accordingly. Now, this is a very ancient practice. Now I forget his name. He's done some great work, and he's promoting this idea earlier, but he looked at these Folkestone drums and noticed that they're at a certain size. And for instance, if you wrapped a rope around the smallest, it would be 10 long feet, or 8 long feet, or 7 long feet. A long foot is 1.056 modern feet. Stonehenge 105.6 feet in diameter, again depending exactly on how you measure, but that's so items that don't look like a standardized ruler or a keeper, well, they would build them accordingly and carry that information through. So something as simple as that has practical applications to it. So Stonehenge, 100 long feet in diameter. Now each lintel was 10 long feet. And that would sort of tie in again with Vitruvius on the symmetry in temples and the human body, that each smaller part of a temple must correspond to the larger and the whole, which was something that just recently did on the pyramid, but that's another application of it. Now, the ancient Indus civilization, most famous is the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. They found a lot of these cubes, and these cubes increase at a ratio of 2, so 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. The 16th would be 13.7 grams, but that these weights, so how would they be set? Well, they would set them with seeds, so like this gunja seeds. Now, because these seeds will grow, they'll tend to be at the same size and same weight, you can set your weights and measures on this principle, and it just so happens that 13.7 or 13.6 grams, depending on the source. Well, in ancient Egypt, they weren't using coinage, but they did have set weights and measures. And for instance, a gold deben would be 13.6 grams. A copper deben was twice that. Copper and gold wasn't distributed as coins, but you could shave off and you could use that as money. So for instance, there's evidence that especially the copper deben, that it bought a set amount of grain, and that over centuries this was stable. So there wasn't this inflation issue or debasement of the currency, but it was linked to copper. Now that would relate to there are very few ancient Egyptian chisels found. Here are some examples of them, because at the end of each day, the workers would have their chisel weighed. Now there would be some loss. However, if people were shaving off a little bit of copper, this would be detected because copper was money. And you could, cheat the system, and it was a very valuable resource. So that's why there's not many chisels left, because they're valuable, they're money. Now, even in the centuries after, these things can be repurposed. So that's why there's not a lot of chisels there. Anyway. But the Egyptian cubit, based on the elbow to the tip of the longest finger, set pi over 6 meters. Now it's interesting, in Bulgaria, this grave find, Varna hoard, 4000 BC approximately. We also have this dish, which happens to be 1 Egyptian royal cubit in length, and these copper plates, which are at a 3:4 ratio, and then they're set to the Egyptian cubit, which also gives you the geometry of not only the Khafre pyramid and the 3-4-5 triangle, also it has the Great Pyramid proportions of 7:11 there. Now that's a bit off topic, but the purpose is that whether it's a dish or whether it's a drum or whether it's a measuring rod, that you can preserve this information, and things would be built to a certain size, and then this could be applied to preserve these sacred weights and measures. Also in Egypt and Phoenicia, for instance, I'll link this paper, and what they talk about is that for instance, the diameter or circumference of these Egyptian beer jars relate to the Egyptian royal cubit, and that the volume of them themselves also relate to the Egyptian heket, which was you're measuring volume. So whether you're selling grain or you're selling wine or beer, they would correspond. And there's also an example of Phoenicians doing this as well. Now this would relate to the Ulaburum shipwreck, where they found these copper and tin ingots, but also all of these amphora. So all the amphora are set at a certain size, whether it's oil or wine. Again, when you arrive or leaving port, the taxman can count them up quickly and again assess your duties. And Romans and Greeks used the same principle with amphora of a certain size to reflect standardized measures, whereas oil, wine, beer, or dry goods such as grain. And again, the same practice with kegs or casks and barrels allows for quick calculation. I'll also link this paper in the description by Jim Wakefield. It's posted at the Dozenal Society, which is this group which believes that the base 12, so 12 inches per foot, for instance, is a superior system to base 10, and there are some good reasons for that. For instance, 10 divided into 3, you get 3.333, as where a dozen or 12, I can divide that into quarters, I can divide that into thirds, I can divide that into halves. It breaks down, and so this is why old measure systems like 12, like a baker's dozen would be 13, but a dozen, if I have a dozen rolls, I can sell them in thirds, I can sell them in quarters, I can sell them in halves or sixths, which you cannot do with base 10. But very interesting paper, he talks about stone circles and these ancient units of measure. Closing sentence, it's all about astronomy, mathematics, geometry and numbers. But the first page, he brings this quote, this like old quote: "A pint's a pound all the world around," or "A pint of pure water weighs a pound and a quarter." So we don't pay much attention to it, but back then weights and measures was very important. You didn't want to be cheated on your pint of beer, you didn't want to be cheated on your pound weight of bread. And so yeah, this will be linked in the description, but he brings up some interesting features. So measuring sticks. Now, a wand. Now, there are different definitions of a wand. The Collins English Dictionary: a stick or a twig, a thin rod carried as a symbol of power, or a rod used by a magician. That's how we think magic wands. Now, I did a series a while ago, magic wands of ancient science, and how whether it's Hermes, Thoth, Nuar and Fuzi, and these other gods of weights and measurement, how these symbols that we use, still important ones in regards to science, such as the caduceus of Hermes, the two snakes around the rod, as a symbol of medicine and science, what their actual origins are, and how across time, cross culture, across the world, how these wands is actually a measuring rod. And because the ancient word in Greek for or wand actually translates to a twig, a rod, wand, or a measuring rod, or even a fishing rod, but measure being the important part and relevant to this particular video. So a wand is a measuring rod. Now again, in the Bible and other texts, they'll talk about the measuring rod and how important that is. And in the book of Enoch, they speak of angels' measure, and even in Revelations, when they're describing New Jerusalem, it's 12,000 by 12,000 by 12,000, and they speak of the angel. It's an angel's measure that they're using. So the gods of magic with their wands include Thoth, Hermes, or Mercury, and they're also the gods of commerce, but in general the gods of science, weights and measures. Gods of magic. Now to paraphrase Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology would appear to be magic. And so what is magic? It's a technology we don't yet understand. But the gods of science, weights and measures, commerce, trade, navigation, well, they all carried a wand, a measuring rod, and it's an important symbol that's used in religion and even secular institutions. Now you can pause to read this, but they're speaking about the Anglo-Saxon wand and the importance of it, and especially like an Anglo housewife called her stick a wand. And what was her stick? Her wand. It was a measuring tool. And so, for instance, this is an antique grain chest from Spain. I picked this particular one because it's got the lovely geometry on it. And you'd also have a grain scoop. So in your house, especially during the winter, they didn't have supermarkets and international trade. It was basically what was local, what you had in your house at the end of the harvest was all you had to get you through the winter. And so a chest like this would be full of grain, and recipes were based on a grain scoop. So one grain scoop wasn't just a random, that was basically enough to make a loaf of bread or a similar quantity. You knew how much you could make from your grain scoop, and you'd want to know how many loaves of bread were left in your grain chest, and they would use a wand, and you just duck the wand inside the grain, and as it went down, you'd be able to measure how much loaves of bread or cakes or rolls you have left to make, which would be very important because you can't run out and just go out and buy flour from the local shop. especially if you're an isolated homestead, you had to get your measures right, and you had to ration your food during the winter to make sure that you would have enough for the next harvest. So it's a bit like in the old-fashioned days, the lady of the house held the key to the larder. Only she was allowed to distribute food. This was the most important position in the household, and they had to ration their cheese, their grain, their wine to get them through the thinner months until the feast time and harvest come back around. But this relates back to grain. So whether it's a grain scoop set recipes were set at a certain amount of grain, and your grain chest would be where you kept your surplus until you got through the winter months. And that's important, grain and measurement, which brings us back to Vitruvian man. And where does a cubit come from? Where does the foot, the finger, the inch, forearm, etc. come from? Well, it comes from grain. That is, to base the original question, that it was these measures was not the king walking around with his forearm displaying it to people and they were able to measure it. There was a system on it. And why grain? Because the grain would be of a certain weight and a certain size. Now, of course, it would vary ever so slightly, but as a general rule, the grains were consistent in size and consistent in weight, and from them you could make weights and measures. Now, for instance, in Anglo-Saxon times, it was defined by law, 1 inch was 3 barley grain. That's where an inch comes from. Now, man is a measure of all things. Also, the rule of thumb that the width of your thumb is an inch, but this would be a more appropriate measure because it would be more consistent across the kingdom, as where men's thumbs change from household to household, let alone town to town. And back in those days, there was less diversity in the types of grain. So, it wasn't like now where we get grain from all around the world. It was pretty much like, just a few varieties in the local region. But grains is also not just a basis of measuring length, it's also a basis of measuring weight. And so, for instance, a troy weight, now 1 grain or GR, so 1 ounce is 20 pennyweights. Each pennyweight is 24 grains, making an ounce. And so grains, and then we have modern grams. Well, actually, it's not so modern as what most might assume, but this how this applies to weights. Well, when you hear about the gold and silver price, they're quoting that in a specific ounce, and that's the troy ounce. That's not the food ounce, that's not the apothecary's ounce, that's the troy ounce, which is a different ounce. Okay, so if you're buying a gold coin and you're a collector, you got to make sure it weighs 31.1034 grams. That's the official weight. It's a trick that people use to make people buy coins, and they undervalue the coin because it's not a true troy ounce. But a troy ounce, each pennyweight is 24 grams. Each ounce is 20 pennyweights. Therefore, a troy ounce is 480 grains. We can use that to measure length. We can use that to measure weight. That's the most important unit when it comes to weights and measures. So a rule of thumb, 12 foot or thumbs per inch. Also 16 fingers per inch. Per foot. So 12 inches. Or 16 fingers / digits. Now, the original word for ounce comes from the Greek or the Roman uncia or oncia. That's where ounce originates from. And we have different, so avoirdupois, if you're buying food or products that grow on plants, okay, the ounce is 28.3495 grams. And there are 16 ounces per pound. There are 16 fingers per foot. There are 12 inches per foot. Now, apothecaries or the chemist weight, pharmacist or the troy weight, they're both at 31.1035 grams. But it's also 12 ounces per pound and 12 ounces per pound. So when you're buying food, it's 16 ounces per pound for a pound of 453.6 grams, as where these pounds and ounces are 373. So whether you're measuring by fingers or by thumbs, this also relates to measuring weights, and these weight measures are also connected to grains. It's interesting that 1 dram on avoirdupois is 27.34375 precisely. Nice little link there to some important stuff. Okay, So Cubit's feet, does it come from the king? No, not really, but there is a connection. So man is a measure of all things. That's the normal Protagoras quote, but it's more in depth. Man is a measure of all things, of things which are, that they are, and of things which are not, that they are not. Well, that's got a connection to this whole system, because man is a measure of all things as a basic principle. Well, an acre is the amount of land one man and one ox can till or plough in a day. The work output of a man is linked to measure systems as well. This is not just to the Romans, but the Roman soldiers or labourers would receive a set ration, which is meant to sustain them in their work. You don't want your workers being weak from hunger, and if they lose weight, they're going to lose their ability. Roman soldiers were expected to march a set length of distance per day, and they would also have a basic ration to sustain them. Again, man is a measure of all things, his work output and how much is required for him to be fed, which is why these measures were set in antiquity the way they were, because they would be linked to the amount, per week, per month, per day you would be required to sustain a healthy working person. And that's why weights, cheese, bread were slightly different. And that's why on cathedrals at marketplaces they would set the size of bread to make sure that you weren't getting underfed and that bakers weren't cheating their clients. Or in ancient Egypt or Phoenicia, where the pot or the jug also contained measure information, whether it was a linear measure such as a cubit, or also how it related to volume, amount of grain or amount of wine that would fill one of these jars. Mohenjo-daro are using seeds or grains, the smallest item, which are many of them, and essentially a set size and weight. We can use them to standardize your weights, and you can use them to standardize your measures of length as well. Now, ideally, you wouldn't every time go out and count grains, but in a pinch, if you didn't have a set weight with you, you could go and grab a handful of grain or seed and make an ounce, and then from an ounce you would make fill a little bag with sand, and then get 2 ounces, and then use a pan scale and double, so you can even make a pound. And out in the field, without an official measure system, you would still get a reasonably accurate tool for merchandise. And that this practice in the ancient Europe and the UK and stone circles set at those sizes, and again up to the modern era, this is so not just for the people buying and selling between each other, but also by having your casks and your cheese wheels at a set size. When you're getting taxed, they can just come along and count them all very quickly, and business goes, and the quicker and more accurate business is, the better it is for everyone. But grains is a basis of not just length, but also a basis of weight, and that it's connected to the output of a man. It's not necessarily, the king has power over weights and measures. So, for instance, the scepter and orb that you'll see royalty carrying, different definitions of it, but one of the important things is that the scepter is a ruler, the ruler controls the ruler, and the orb is a weight. And only the king or the noble, it's his duty, one of his most important duties was to set these weights and to govern them and make sure that the bakers or cheesemakers, wine sellers or coin makers as well were not cheating the system. And if you got caught, you were in a lot of trouble. It's also written in the stars with, for instance, Aquarius carrying the amphora, which was one of these standardized weights in the Greco-Roman world. And he also holds, now there's also the orb there, but that's actually, Norman Nilotica, a sacred ruler to measure flooding, building and roads. So you'll see, for instance, a couple of statues here in Sydney with Queen Victoria, the scepter and orb. Well, that relates to Virgo. She carries the rod, a measuring rod, and she also carries grains, which can be used to measure. And it's just nicely that she's, when you actually look at the constellations, the grain is right above Libra. So man is a measure of all things, but it's his work output, the amount of food he needs per day. Man is a measure of all things, or things which are, that they are, and of things which are not, that they are not. So that's the end of this short little series. I just wanted to answer that question: where did the cubit come from? Well, it's not. It's stored in much more efficient ways than the king's forearm, and that's not how it happens anyway. Have a good one.